So welcome, Ian. It is so lovely to have you on the Integrative Medicine Matters podcast. We got to know each other through student choice placements with Bristol University. I've been learning so much from you about ketogenic diets, low-carb diets, how the body really functions, its metabolism. So we're just going to dive into this conversation. The question, why does integrative medicine matter to you?
Yeah, that's an interesting one from my perspective, because I obviously trained as a scientist. I had a degree in biochemistry before I embarked on a degree in medicine. So I'm trained in a very tight scientific way. But of course, in medicine, we know that people get better in spite of our best efforts rather than because of our best efforts. You have to think, well, what is it about their lives that are getting better? There are other inputs into their lives other than us that can help them. We all know sort of psychological tools that can help. About 20 years ago now, I did a diploma in traditional Chinese medicine and acupuncture. It was 18 weekends, so it's quite grueling, and it was taught by Chinese doctors who had come over from Beijing to teach us. And I started to see a whole nother way of managing health rather than illness, but studying health. Because I tried to study health, and then we clearly expected to study illness, but studying health is very compelling. And of course, the Chinese idea of the meridians flowing, energy chi flowing through meridians, and how you can identify disease through the tongue diagnosis as well as pulse diagnosis. I thought, this is different completely to what I've been taught. But, there are a billion people on the planet who, over thousands of years, have fairly successfully applied that. So, it opened my eyes big time that there are other ways of seeing the body and exploring health. So I think integrative medicine is more about exploring and applying health through all disciplines that apply to healthy practice, which of course, as a trained medical doctor, we don't quite see it in the same way. I don't think I think we know it's there, but our training and our approach tends to be a little bit more directed towards one aspect of human existence. And of course, we know there are many, choose your numbers of pillars of health. And we try to help that, but it's very difficult to apply in a 10-minute consultation to do all that. So for me, it doesn't matter to me how people get better, as long as we can encourage them to go along a path which will help them to get better, really.
Yeah, I love hearing that, those kind of pathways to health. And I agree that, within the model is kind of well-being prevention, and also working out when we get out of balance early on rather than waiting or watching while we develop illness. So I know the Chinese doctors, weren't paid if you got ill.
Yeah.
You were only
Yeah.
paid if you stayed well.
Yes, that's a great concept, isn't it?
It's a great concept. So I love to hear that science, medicine, and then these other whole system approaches influencing everything you do. And exciting that you're a very busy mainstream doctor. You've also got your own personal story, haven't you, of what's made you now an expert in the field of type 1 diabetes and the ketogenic diet. Tell us about that.
Well, yes, they say, don't they, that necessity is the mother of invention. So I have type 1 diabetes for my sins. I've had it for just over 30 years now. I can't remember, 32 years or something like that. Long enough to, it's boring now. I've got over the novelty of type 1 diabetes. I discovered a different way of managing it from how I was traditionally taught to manage it about 20 years into my diabetes career, if you call it that. So when I was diagnosed in my 30s, I was later onset type 1 diabetes. I went straight onto insulin and managed it in the way I only knew, which was to count the carbohydrates and to inject the insulin to suit. That didn't seem to be a good strategy for me. I mean, there are 400,000 people in the UK with type 1 diabetes, and I always argue there are 400,000 ways of managing it. Some people are less autoimmune than others. Some people are able to get away with far worse glucose control than others and not seem to get complications. And other people, despite their best efforts, seem to get complications early. And I think we see this in a lot of autoimmune diseases, don't we? Something like rheumatoid arthritis and MS and things like that, where some people just don't seem to do as well despite their best efforts. What I try to say with type 1 is we're all on our own journeys, but applying some very basic principles to it will help. But those basic principles don't really come from my formal training. They came from an accidental discovery of a doctor called Richard Bernstein, who himself had type 1 diabetes. He was an engineer. He got hold of one of the very first glucose monitors because his wife worked in medicine and he was able to get one. It was the size of an old-fashioned, like a cassette recorder. Is quite big. He's analytically looked at glucose and insulin and worked out that, the more glucose you have, the more insulin you need. And then, of course, it was logical for an engineer to say, well, the less glucose you have, probably the less insulin you need. And the less insulin you need, the fewer the complications you get. So I read that book, and it was all about cutting down the carbohydrates, which are the macronutrient that stimulate insulin the most. The protein and fat do stimulate sugar production, not so much as carbohydrates. So he cut his carbs down to 30 grams a day, and most people are taking between 250 and 300 grams a day. Certainly type 1s are encouraged to have that amount. And he got some amazing results, went to the American Diabetes Association and said, hey, well, what about this? And they didn't seem to be interested. He was an engineer at the time. Then he trained to become a doctor because he was so cross that he wasn't being listened to. He died aged 92 in his sleep, and he was practicing till he died. He was practicing medicine till he died. An amazing guy. The key thing about Richard Bernstein, though, was that he had complications when he was in his 40s, when he discovered the low-carb diet, which resolved on changing his diet, which goes to show that metabolism, when you adapt it to optimize health, it can change your disease profile as well. Not always, but in his case.
And I think that, in the past 5 years, we've really understood the nature of metabolic health, metabolic syndrome, inflammation in the body, how that plays out. In type 1 diabetes, you can get this accelerated inflammation. How amazing to hear a story of reversal, because of course, once you've understood what's happening in the body, by taking too much insulin, by having glucose that's too high, you can lower inflammation. Do you want to say a little bit about that loop so our viewers and listeners can understand it?
Yes. So the thing about insulin is it's a major metabolic hormone. One of its many roles is to reduce blood glucose. And blood glucose obviously is a symptom of type 1 diabetes. Blood glucose isn't the cause of type 1, it's a symptom. The cause of type 1 is a lack of insulin. So we have to inject insulin in order to control the symptom. Now, glucose will go up mostly with macronutrients and diet, but glucose also raises with lifestyle practices, anxiety, depression, lack of physical activity, not getting enough daylight or access to green spaces. Insulin actually has a circadian rhythm of sensitivity as well. And we inject a lot of insulin to try to manage all those background functions. But the problem with insulin is that it is in too high an amount. It is what's called pro-inflammatory. It sets up inflammatory processes. It also helps the body to retain salt. I don't know why it does that. It's one of its what's called mineralocorticoid actions on the kidney. And with salt comes water, and with salt and water in a closed system comes pressure. So hypertension, high blood pressure is strongly associated with all forms of diabetes. Insulin's, one of its roles in getting glucose out of the bloodstream is it stores it in muscle, and it sends it to muscle, it sends it to liver through the action of something called glucose transport receptors. One particular of the 12 to 15 glucose transport receptors, one in particular is responsible for controlling the blood glucose so it's at a perfect level between 4 and 7 millimoles per liter, which is a very, very narrow range. So insulin's job is to provide an environment around each cell, the interstitial fluid bathing each cell, that leaks out of blood vessels so that the concentration of glucose is perfect for the cell. So the cell can grab what it wants. It will only go into the cell if the cell needs it. But clearly, if the blood glucose is too high or too low, you've got problems with the cell energy systems. So insulin's role is many. It causes hypertension when blood glucose disappears into the liver or into active working muscle. Obviously, the glucose has to go somewhere. So it's converted to a glucose energy store called glycogen. But primarily, if our glycogen stores are full, which they mostly are, it will get converted by the liver into fat. So sugar becomes fat. And probably the biggest source of fat in our bodies is carbohydrates if you have a high carbohydrate meal. So sugar is converted to fat in the body under the influence of insulin. And that can cause, if the liver can't clear it fast enough, if we're eating 3 meals a day plus 2 carbohydrate snacks a day or whatever, the liver builds up and becomes fatty. So you get hypertension, you get weight gain, you get fatty liver, all as a result of the influence of insulin on the system. Now, the problem with type 1 diabetes is that we inject insulin into the wrong place in the body. We inject it into the skin, and there's no pancreas in the skin. We inject the wrong formula. Insulin in someone without type 1 diabetes will be instantly produced when the blood glucose goes above 5.6. And it will decay within 7 to 10 minutes. Our insulin hasn't even started working for 15 minutes, and it lasts 1 to 2 hours. And insulin is compartmentalized in the body. Mostly it should be hanging around the liver, but in somebody who injects it, it spends more time in the periphery. So getting the insulin in the right place at the right time in type 1 diabetes is a very, very difficult job indeed, which means that people with type 1 are mostly in the state of high insulin, and that can cause insulin resistance over a long period of time.
Mm.
So it's a tricky one, isn't it? It's tricky just getting that balance right. And I think that we in type 1 diabetes, certainly, I think we prioritize glucose control over insulin control. It doesn't seem to matter to people whether they're, if you get a flat glucose trace of, say, 5, perfect. If it's 5 on your CGM, your doctor will give you a round of applause and say, wow, you're going to have a fantastic HbA1c. It's just going to be perfect. And the long-term measure of glucose control, which is called HbA1c, the amount of sugar that's stuck to red blood cells, the long-term measure over 2 to 3 months. I mean, that's considered the gold standard of good diabetes control. But what if you're using 1,000 units of insulin to get to perfect glucose control? Is that good management? I don't personally think it is, because I've studied the healthy human being, and I think healthy humans who live healthy lifestyles without diabetes have very low natural insulin levels, and they can access other fuels other than glucose. And I'll talk about that a bit if you want to in a minute.
Yeah, and I've been learning about this with my own metabolic health, separate type 1 diabetes, but just how important it is for the body to keep insulin as low as possible to avoid that fat deposition. Also to allow the body to kind of clear and cleanse and get rid of things. So you made this big step, didn't you, to focus on lowering insulin at the same time as maintaining a good glucose, which is just vital.
Yeah.
When did you take that step to lower your carbs in your diet?
12 years ago, I had a crisis. I'd been on a long distance cycling trip, and I was camping on my own in a field in Norway, idyllic, proper man of a certain age thing to do. And I woke up with a hypo, and I must have mismanaged my insulin injections because I ran out of all of my food supplies, and I still had a hypo at that time, in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the night, 4 a.m. So I had to pack up my kit as camping, solo camping. And I thought, and I could still reason, but I had spots in my eyes like a typical hypo, couldn't see much. But I thought, I'm going to go and cycle to the road here. So if I can get to a road and collapse on a road, at least there's a chance that I might get spotted by someone. It was that dire, And then I got onto the road, and not far along that road was a lay-by with some discarded food in it. And that's how I luckily survived. It was pure luck. And after that, I got my first letter saying you've got early diabetic retinopathy. And at the same time, I was getting what's called autonomic symptoms, where just standing up from sitting, blood pressure couldn't catch up, and you were feeling like you're going to faint all the time. General aches and pains of inflammation. And so it was that time that I decided to make the shift onto low carbohydrate diet. I remember the first day I just made an omelette thinking this is completely stupid. This is nothing to do with low-fat diets. What on earth are you doing as a doctor doing this? And I'd bought a CGM because I didn't qualify for one, continuous glucose meter, and the trace was flat. Boom. And that was the first time for 20 years that I'd managed to get that level of control. And it was profound. I still remember it. And then at lunchtime and in the evening, and then and it just carried on and on and on. So I kept on that strategy. Subsequently, as I refined it, I discovered that I want to look more into my basal dose. What affects my basal dose? So I came up with this idea that this discovery really through a trip I did, that insulin can be managed. You can manage insulin around not just your diet, but physical activity, around your mind, your mental health effects, your insulin expression, sodas not being in green spaces, sodas not sleeping properly, eating at the wrong time, etc. So I started to refine this idea that if we optimize our insulin, we get fewer hypos because we haven't got too much insulin in our body. But the glucose control will follow that. And you can't say that the other way around. If you optimize your glucose, you can't guarantee that the insulin is going to follow that. But the problem with insulin, as we know, it's pro-inflammatory, and it is not good for health if it's in too high a quantity.
And 12 years ago, you were totally ahead of the curve here. We still, I still meet type 1 diabetics who are told very clearly they must be eating carbs. So there seems to be a lack of understanding. I'm just on a 5-day prolonged fast at the moment, caloric restriction. My glucose, actually, I woke up this morning at 5.6, which I think is a little bit high, curiously, but probably cortisol release from a degree of stress fasting. But my ketone level is 1, and I'm feeling really good. And I think that one of the things that we're turning on its head now, both, across all conditions, is whether we need carbs. We've been told we need carbs, but once we understand that all food is getting to that substrate of glucose, and that the body can very beautifully control things, and what it likes is to use insulin, but not big amounts. Would you agree with that?
100%.
A precious commodity.
Yeah, 100%. Carbs are very important for the body, but you don't need to consume them to make them. Glucose is a very important fuel. I think the fact that we've got, it varies, but between 12 and 15 recognized glucose transport receptors in tissue suggests that glucose is an important molecule, an important nutrient for cells. However, the body makes what it needs. You can make up to 60 grams of carbohydrates a day for more than your requirements, from the liver converting it in what's called gluconeogenesis, where the body takes other nutrients and converts them into glucose for you. So you don't need to eat glucose in order to have enough of it in your body. There are some tissues in the brain and red blood cells that are obligate users of glucose. They cannot not use any other fuel. But the body isn't stupid, overrides the frail human brain and says, I'm not going to leave you to sort my survival out. I'm going to do it myself. So thank you very much. You can eat what you like, but I'm going to make sure you survive. People who are in earthquake zones, poor things, and get pulled out of rubble 8 days later. Well, they're still alive, and they still have, if you took their blood glucose, it would be normal. Because the body regulates it for them, you see. The body's used to frugal times, and it will produce the glucose as needed in-house. So you don't need to eat it in order to use it.
And one thing you taught me, which I think is really important for anyone who is finding their weight gaining, getting their tummy getting bigger and then feeling more sluggish and less energy, that whilst you release insulin, you will switch off fat burning. So understanding is you do have to drop your insulin to fat burn. Would that be right, Ian?
100%. Yeah. So it's a very elegant system that we have. If we have high glucose, the body will use glucose. But if we have too much glucose, the body will store it. And in the process of storing it, it requires insulin. And what insulin does, one of the things it does is promote a hormone that promotes the storage of fat, converting glucose into fatty acids, basically. And then those fats get sent from the liver to the adipose tissue for storage. So when you have high carbohydrate diets, you naturally have to have a high insulin level in order to get rid of the excess carbohydrates from your bloodstream to provide the cells with a perfect glucose environment into the liver, and the liver converts it into fat. When you have low carbohydrates, you have low insulin levels because there's no need for the insulin to be secreted if it's not detecting a sugar that's going up, and carbohydrates are the principal fuel that puts sugar up. And then your body releases another hormone under the influence of insulin that actually promotes fat breakdown, and the fat breakdown will provide fatty acids, and the end result of fatty acid breakdown is ketone bodies. Now, the liver, every cell in the body can make their ketone bodies. However, the liver can't use them. So the liver lacks an enzyme that enables it to use ketone bodies. So when the liver breaks down fat under the influence of low insulin levels, so you get low insulin, fat burning, but the liver cannot use the ketones it produces, so they flow out of the liver into the bloodstream, and we can measure that in our finger prick testing. And then they head up for the brain, because the brain can't use fatty acids in great quantities. It's just not designed for it. The fatty acids can't cross into the brain very easily, not the sort of ones that come from fat breakdown anyway. So we have this elegant system where low insulin will produce fatty acids and therefore ketone bodies, and the liver cannot use them, so it sends them up to the brain, and the rest of the fatty acids get used by the body outside of the brain, if you see what I mean.
So does the liver have to use glucose then for its
It can
fuel?
make glucose. No, it can use fatty acids, and it can
can use
make
fatty acids
glucose.
as well.
Yeah, and it can make glucose. So it's very versatile, but it's very elegant, isn't it? That the brain needs ketones because you can't get access to fats. The brain will still take the glucose it requires, but equally, the ketones can go into the brain and provide an alternative fuel for it. And we do know, we're increasingly aware that many, many mental health conditions respond very well to ketone bodies. They seem to be a natural fuel for brain cells.
Yeah, there's some lovely research studies going on now with things like bipolar.
Yeah.
Just showing, brain function. Also, for postmenopausal women, there's some evidence emerging that actually ketones are a bit better in terms of brain fog, so perimenopause. When we were teaching together, one of the things that I got clear on with your teaching is just this idea. You mentioned 30 grams of carbohydrate, which would put us into what we would call a ketogenic diet.
Yeah.
What I'm interested in, and what we try and teach at the National Centre for Integrative Medicine with the public as well, we're just launching new workshops where we can talk about all of this and cook low carb food together and eat it, which is very enjoyable, but is just that kind of 30 to 80, 90 grams. That's kind of a moderate kind of low carb. Would that be right? But a lot of people, as you said, are eating at least 250 grams will always create surplus unless you're marathon running. But am I right with that?
Yeah.
Kind of
Yes.
station?
Yes. And 1 gram of carbohydrates will generate about 4 calories of energy. So 30 grams of carbs will only generate 120 calories. So 90 calories or 100 grams of carbs will only generate 400 calories of energy. So the rest of the energy has to be met from fat breakdown. So that will produce ketosis for most of the time.
And how many grams a day do you aim for as a type 1?
I aim for as few as possible, but I end up roughly between 20 and 30 as it happens.
Yeah, because an apple is 20, isn't it?
Probably. Yeah. I don't eat apples, so I don't know.
And roughly how much insulin do you take over a 24-hour period?
I use about 20 to 25 units depending on what I'm eating. Roughly that. It's, when I did just a long distance cycle ride, I got down to 18 units a day. And when I was when I was much younger, but eating high carbs, I was on about 40 units a day of insulin.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't want us to worry type 1 diabetics listening. It's like you can have very good control in lots of different ways. I guess the message that we're giving is just to review this element of carbohydrates, particularly if your control is challenging. Um, so you've been writing a book and it's about to come out in May. What's it called?
It's called Shifting Gears, the 1,000-mile ride that changed my mindset on type 1 diabetes. It's really a, the culmination of all of my learning, really. I got invited to do a conference talk in St. Moritz in Switzerland, and I had a bit of time to spare, so I took some time off work, and I thought, well, I'll allow some time and I'll cycle there, because my talk was about sport and type 1 diabetes. So I thought, what better way to arrive than on a bike? But really, it was about putting out there how type 1 can be managed in physical activity. And I put 21 days worth of continuous glucose meters. I took 21 days worth of continuous ketone meters. I wore a heart trace. I monitored all my food and obviously the distance traveled. So it was a fairly comprehensive study of type 1 diabetes. The reason I wrote the book was that it's very difficult for people to get information that is consistent. You go to some doctors and they will give you information that isn't up to date, really. And that's really a training issue. And, everyone is at a certain stage in their knowledge base with respect to metabolism. And there are some quite scary things, like if you're taking insulin, you have to eat carbs. Well, why don't you just cut your insulin down? Then you won't need as many carbs, for example. Oh, you're going to end up in diabetic ketoacidosis if you're on a keto diet. Completely untrue. Things like that. So it was written really with the view to exploring 21 days of type 1 diabetes, cycle 1,000 miles in my shoes. That's what it's like for me, but everyone's different, as we said. So you quite rightly said we don't want to suggest there's only one way of managing type 1 diabetes, because as I said at the start, there's 400,000 ways of managing it in the UK alone. 40 million ways of managing it around the world. But I tried to use shifting gears as the idea of a paradigm shift in how we understand type 1 diabetes, and how we probably should be thinking about insulin much more than we think about glucose. Glucose will follow good insulin control. But as I said earlier, you can't guarantee that good insulin will follow good glucose control. It depends on lifestyle change.
Yes, and some people are saying we should be measuring insulin rather than HbA1c, which could still be good, but your insulin could be too high.
Yeah.
And you could be, which was the case for me. I was able to finally work out that I was insulin resistant with a normal HbA1c. Let's talk about the fact that for most people, including many doctors, they worry about ketones in a type 1 diabetic. So, like, what ketone level are you measuring today or yesterday? Like, where does it run?
Well, it's roughly 0.6 to 0.7 nearly all the time. That's my level. I can't get it much higher. I went up when I did a 100-mile run over 5 days with no food at all as part of a project. And it went up to 6.5 or something. Felt completely well. But typically every day with 20 grams of carbs, for me, for the way my body works, it's about 0.6, 0.7. 75% of people with type 1 are in the range 0.5 to 1.5. And don't forget, because type 1s have more insulin in their bodies than non-type 1s, just to make it work, we're very resilient to going into ketosis. You struggle to get into ketosis because we got too much insulin on board.
Yeah. And I think, today on day 5 of this prolonged fast I'm doing, my ketones are 1, but I regard, anything like 0.3 to 0.9 as what I call a kind of a gentle nutritional ketosis. That is very different from a highly dysregulated body with a very high sugar. We probably should just say, if you could, a little bit about a diabetic ketoacidosis and why that is very different from a nutritional ketosis.
Yes. So nutritional ketosis is self-regulated. So in someone without diabetes type 1, the ketone bodies that float around in your bloodstream will pass by the pancreas, and they will stimulate the pancreas to secrete insulin. So in somebody without type 1 diabetes, high ketones will be regulated by the body producing insulin. And as we said earlier, insulin will block fat burning and promote fat storage. So you've got this regulatory step. If you're in nutritional ketosis, so you're not eating carbs very much, but your ketone levels are higher, you haven't got that regulatory step, but you do have access to insulin. So if your blood glucose is rising and your ketones are rising, insulin will control the situation. And of course, everyone with type 1 is taught to do correction doses to keep their blood sugar normal. There's an interesting example. I did a long distance cycle ride, as I said, and there's one day, because we're all type 1s are taught you've got too much insulin on board, you have to cut it down, keep cutting your insulin down, or eat to stop yourself going hypo. But one day, one morning, I hadn't obviously injected enough insulin because my blood glucose was going up, and in parallel, my ketones were going up together, just like that. Blood glucose got to about 9, and my ketones got to 3. And I thought, aha, this is unusual. I thought it must be that I haven't injected enough insulin today. I've not got enough insulin working in my body. Very unusual situation. So I made a correction dose of 1 unit of insulin, 1 unit. And over the next 3/4 of an hour, my ketone levels went from 3 to 0.5. Boom. Insulin, a perfect example of insulin suppressing ketosis. So if you're on a keto diet or a low carb diet, you will expect to get some ketones. However, and this is why doctors get very apprehensive, is that if you're on a high insulin, high carbohydrate diet, you should never have ketones in your system because you're suppressing fat burning. You're in fat storage mode all the time. So if a patient turns up to you with high ketones, you think, are they on a keto diet? No. Are you starving? No. Are you not taking your insulin because you put some weight? No. Yes, I'm taking insulin. So they must therefore be ill or about to get very ill. And therefore that is a medical emergency. So in a high carbohydrate diet, ketones in the bloodstream are potentially serious. If you feel you just haven't injected enough insulin, just inject some insulin, correct the sugar, and that should bring everything down. But if it doesn't work and you're getting ill, your ketones levels will go up and up and up. And you were saying yours is about 1, mine's 0.7. Diabetic ketoacidosis, the requirements are the person really is ill. They've got a very high blood sugar. They've got a very strong thirst. And their ketones are in the order of 10 to 15. We're not talking 1, 2, 0.5. We're talking massively high ketone levels. So it's not something I've ever worried about. And I did a survey on my website, and very few people worry about ketones on a keto diet. It just doesn't happen to them. The only time most people...
Yeah. The less insulin you're injecting, the less likely you are to be hypo as well, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. About 6 times fewer hypos, according to some research done in 2013, ages ago.
How many people are exploring a low-carb diet as a type 1 diabetic? Do you happen to know?
A tiny percentage, I think.
Yeah.
I think people are interested in it. A lot of people, I have a little coaching session on my website for people with type 1. They've obviously discovered it, and it's not very popular. 1 or 2 people a week sort of contact me, or probably 3, numbers less than 10 anyway. But people are already curious by then. And the majority of people are trying low carb naturally, even if they don't do a very low carb diet. A lot of people naturally know that they should be cutting their carbs with their diabetes, just because of simple observation over years. I mean, every single day, we don't get a day off. Every single minute of the day, we have to be worrying about diabetes, really.
And can you do intermittent fasting as a type 1 diabetic? Can you stop eating at 7 and not eat again until 7?
Yes, is the answer to that. I encourage it really because it is sympathetic to insulin's diurnal rhythm. Insulin has its own rhythm. We tend to be most insulin sensitive about mid-morning to late afternoon. That is our time of maximum sensitivity. First thing in the morning, the adrenaline and cortisol that happens when we wake up produces a high blood glucose level. And the interesting thing about people with no diabetes is that high glucose level is caused by the adrenaline stopping the pancreas from secreting insulin.
Interesting.
So it's determined to put the sugar up for some reason. And of course, and it also modifies the sensitivity of the glucose receptors, which get the sugar out of the bloodstream. So adrenaline will get the blood sugar up. Now, in someone without diabetes, obviously at some point that will wear off and your insulin will work well again. But it tries to discourage insulin from being secreted. So when we have a very early breakfast, we're at the maximum insulin resistance phase where insulin's not working very well. So we have to be careful because our insulin takes 3 hours to wear off. So we'll be coming off that curve when we're becoming more insulin sensitive and our insulin's still working. So however much insulin we use first thing is now become from an insulin resistance phase to an insulin sensitive phase. And then it puts us at more risk of hypos at that point. So timing of meals in type 1 is quite important, really. And not eating too late at night, because again, you tend to get more insulin resistant throughout the night time. So I only eat 2 meals a day personally, but others will choose to eat 3. I know people who eat 3 meals a day on a keto diet. And then it gives you that window of fasting, which will help with other anti-inflammatory processes in the body.
Yeah, because we know that, for example, gut health benefits from everything, just benefits from us not eating continuously. We
Yeah,
were not
100%.
designed to do that.
Yeah.
So we're nearly coming up to the end, and I feel we've just begun. But with your book, what else would you most like to communicate? What messages would you love to get out there?
Yeah, thank you. Well, the book is written in 2 parts. There's a travel journal and then there's a textbook, basically. But the textbook is aimed to the 12 to 15-year-old readership, so it should cover the majority of people who don't have medical backgrounds. So it will give people all the information they need to understand what we've been talking about and understand how insulin works across the 5 foundations of health and what insulin is and how it was discovered, etc. But I think the key thing I always try to put across is that we should use insulin wisely as much as necessary. When you get infection, you might need 3-4 times your insulin dose than not. So as much as necessary, but aim to have as little as possible. So understanding how insulin operates across all aspects of life is very, very important. I think the other thing about type 1 diabetes is that I think we should be trying to understand what we talk about right at the start, what is a healthy human being? How does a healthy human being look? Do they eat 3 meals a day plus snacks? Do they have high insulin levels? And are they fasting or are they not fasting? What does a healthy human being look like? We want some of that, bearing in mind all the limitations of insulin and diabetes. So I think we should be looking to give ourselves metabolic flexibility.
Yes.
As well. So enable our body to choose if it wants ketones, choose if it wants. We provide this substrate, the cells will choose what they want. So, mental health, if we know that ketone bodies are useful in mental health, some mental health conditions, especially migraine as well, the body's there to provide it. So lower insulin states, I think are very useful.
So you're kind of reclaiming health for the type 1 diabetic. You're kind of saying, look, we don't need to compromise as much as we may be told. We could really, and of course, exercise, again, you've really communicated through this interview, but also with your book that, you can exercise if you understand how to inject the right amount.
I think that's right. It's just one example before we finish. I mean, I always say I'm someone who's exercising who happens to have type 1 diabetes.
Lovely.
I'm not someone with type 1 diabetes who is exercising. There's a world of difference between those two things.
Yeah.
I don't have to plan. If you said, do you want to go for a run now? Great, let's go. I don't even need to worry about my sugar. I need to take sugar with me just in case, but I don't worry about it.
Yes,
and there's a great
insulin is low.
Yeah, there's a great example on the last day. I had to climb over a big mountain pass, a Julia Pass in Switzerland on my bike. And it was only a 20-mile journey because I had to get somewhere at a certain time. So I didn't want to break down, have a puncture. But it required 5 hours of cycling up this big mountain pass, 2,600 meters and down the other side. And I had a small breakfast, injected my insulin and off I went. And when I got there, my host said, how's your blood glucose? I said, I don't know. I haven't checked it since I left the hotel this morning. And that was the absolute truth. And I tapped on the meter and it was 4.8. I hadn't had to worry for 5 hours of intense cycling about my diabetes. And that is a gift. That is such a lucky thing to have.
That is a gift. I
Mm,
know that from
mm.
having family members with type 1 diabetes,
Yes.
that that
Yeah.
horrible sense of unease of,
Mm,
what can I do before there are issues? And as
mm.
you say, you have to kind of always go prepared, but the beauty
Yeah.
is that if you haven't injected a lot of insulin, because your diet hasn't demanded it, then you don't
Mm,
need to worry. Um, Amazing to hear your story as a biochemist, then a doctor, and then developing this condition, because it's like you drilled into the detail of understanding, haven't you? Like, even when I
mm.
listen to you, I suddenly understand, of course, that adrenaline will block insulin because it wants sugar for the flight or fright,
Yeah.
doesn't it?
Mm,
It doesn't
mm,
want anything lowering sugar when you're
mm.
sprinting away
Yes.
from the saber-toothed tiger. But
Yes, absolutely.
I'd never thought about that when
Mm,
I would note in my blood sugars that, on days where I was stressed that, I had more glucose than I thought.
mm,
Or
mm.
that my family member with type 1 diabetes who'd get up and say, "Look, I haven't even eaten, but my
Yeah.
blood sugar's 10." You see what I mean?
Yes. 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 Yes.
There's a lot to understand, isn't there,
Mm,
about the
mm,
body and what it's
mm.
doing to kind of create balance.
Yes, it's a fascinating journey, isn't it? Going on this journey of discovery on holistic medicine.
Yeah.
It's
And also,
absolutely.
I find myself on so many podcasts just honoring the body and
Mm,
how, we can forget most of the time, and it's just doing all of these things
mm.
for us. But when we start even to understand a bit, I kind of think, wow, respect,
Yeah. It's a
incredible.
very elegant system. I mean, we'll never ever discover, I don't think, everything. I mean, our brains are too small to discover all of these chemical
Yeah,
reactions that are so subtle. This interplay of insulin with all of the other 20, 30 different hormones instantaneously changes all of the time.
yeah,
So we need to respect that. We need to get insulin to as close as physiological as we can in type 1 diabetes. So it
yeah.
works well with all the other hormones.
And you've also been bringing in a whole theme of kind of chronobiology, the idea,
Yeah.
that there are timings, diurnal rhythms, that also need to be understood. And we've kind of started to understand for melatonin, but now you're telling me you can understand that for insulin, like again is a burgeoning area of science that
Mm.
we will be understanding more and more the timing of medication, the timing of eating, to kind of match where the body is at that time.
I think that's right. There's lots of evidence for light therapy in depression. If you give it in the morning, it's twice as effective as if you give it at night or later on in the day.
Yeah.
Simple things. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you, Ian, because I know that you've drawn quite a lot of fire over the years because of kind of offering quite a radical view. I know it's not been your own. You mentioned Dr. Briston, is it?
Yeah. Bernstein. Yeah.
Bernstein. But I think that the times are shifting and changing right across, as I said, health and well-being, so that we understand in general if we can keep insulin low, and the way that we can do that and still have lots of fun is to drop our carbs. And it's something I say to a lot of patients in my practice. Let's just look at how we might drop your carbohydrates but still enjoy life. So thank you, Ian.
Exactly. Thank you very much. Very enjoyable. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you.